You know that moment when your whole world tilts sideways and everything you thought you knew about love and family gets ripped away in a single sentence? I was sitting in that sterile law office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, watching my stepchildren's faces as the lawyer read their father's will, and there was Jessica with that smug little smile. There was Michael leaning back like he owned the place. They'd been waiting for this moment. To my beloved children, Jessica and Michael, I leave the house, all investments, and the remainder of my estate, the lawyer droned, and Jessica actually giggled while I sat there in my black funeral dress, still wearing my wedding ring. But it was Michael who delivered the killing blow, looking right at me with those eyes so much like his father's, saying with casual cruelty, "You get nothing, Mom." The word dripping with venom, and 25 years of loving those kids like my own blood meant nothing. But then the lawyer cleared his throat, reached into his briefcase, and pulled out a second envelope that made Jessica's smile falter. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Let me tell you how this all started, because you need to understand what those 25 years really meant, what I poured into this family that never wanted me in the first place. I was 28 when I met Richard, a widow with 2 kids who were 8 and 10, and I thought I was getting a ready-made family, thought love would be enough to bridge whatever gaps existed between us. I was so naive, so hopeful, believing that if I just loved them hard enough, consistently enough, they'd eventually see me as more than their father's second choice. I gave up my career in marketing to be home when they got off the school bus. I learned to make Michael's favorite chocolate chip cookies from scratch. I sat through every single one of Jessica's piano recitals, even when she refused to make eye contact with me in the audience. I drove them to soccer practice and dance lessons, helped with homework at the kitchen table, packed their lunches with little notes that they threw away without reading. And when they got sick, I was the one checking their fevers at 2 in the morning while Richard worked his demanding job as an engineer. I funded their college educations without question, walked Jessica down the aisle at her wedding when she decided she wanted her stepmother there after all, held my tongue when Michael brought home girlfriends who treated me like hired help in my own house. 25 years of birthday parties where I was tolerated, Christmas mornings where my gifts were opened last and with obvious reluctance, family photos where I always stood slightly apart because that's where they positioned me. Richard would squeeze my hand and whisper that they'd come around, that time would heal the wounds left by their mother's death. But deep down I knew they saw me as an intruder who had stolen their father's attention, a woman who had dared to love where they thought no one should love again. Still, I kept trying, kept giving, kept hoping, because that's what you do when you build a family. You don't give up on people just because they give up on you. Those early years, though, God, I threw myself into that family with everything I had, convinced that love could conquer the awkwardness and grief that hung over that house like a cloud. I remember Michael's first Little League game after Richard and I got married, how I showed up with a cooler full of orange slices and Gatorade, cheering louder than any of the other parents when he hit that double to left field, and for just a moment I saw him smile at me from second base before he caught himself and looked away. I spent countless evenings at the kitchen table with Jessica, helping her with algebra homework that made my head spin, celebrating when she finally grasped those equations, and her face lit up with understanding. And I thought maybe this is it. Maybe this is when she starts to trust me. I attended every single soccer game, every piano recital, every school play, sometimes sitting alone in the bleachers when other parents assumed I was just a neighbor, but I didn't care because those kids were becoming mine in my heart, even if I wasn't becoming theirs. When Jessica wanted to go to that expensive private college for her art degree, I was the one who suggested we liquidate some of our savings to make it happen. And when Michael decided he wanted to study engineering like his father, I worked extra freelance projects to help cover his expenses because I believed we were building something together, this blended family that would eventually heal. Richard would hold me at night after particularly difficult days when the kids had been especially cold, and he'd promise me that everything I was doing mattered, that they'd understand someday how much I loved them, how much I'd sacrificed for them. "You're the best thing that ever happened to us," he'd whisper in my ear. "And I'll make sure you're always taken care of, no matter what happens to me, because you've earned your place in this family 10 times over." Those promises felt like gold then, like insurance policies written in love and gratitude. And I believed him completely, because why wouldn't I? I was building a legacy of love, creating memories and traditions, becoming the mother figure these kids needed even if they couldn't admit it. And Richard saw all of it, appreciated all of it, promised me that my devotion would never be forgotten or dismissed, that I'd always have a home and security because I'd earned it through years of unconditional love. But something shifted when they became adults. Something cold and calculating that I didn't want to see at first, because admitting it meant admitting that all those years of love might have been wasted on people who were just waiting for their chance to push me out. Jessica started having these hushed phone conversations with Michael that would stop the moment I walked into a room. And there were family dinners at restaurants where they'd already ordered appetizers before I arrived, like they'd been planning without me, discussing things I wasn't meant to hear. Michael got married and somehow forgot to include me in the wedding planning conversations. And when I asked about helping with the reception costs like we'd done for Jessica, there was this uncomfortable silence before Richard stepped in to smooth things over. But I caught the look that passed between his children, that eye roll that said, "Here she goes again, thinking she belongs." The holiday traditions I'd spent decades building started getting reorganized without my input. Suddenly Christmas morning was happening at Jessica's house instead of ours. And when I asked about bringing my famous green bean casserole, Jessica said they were simplifying this year. But I later found out she'd asked her mother-in-law to bring 3 different side dishes. There were family photos being taken without me, group texts I wasn't included in, inside jokes that stopped when I walked into rooms, and this growing sense that I was being erased from the narrative of this family I'd helped build with my own hands and heart. Richard would get frustrated when I brought up these exclusions, telling me I was reading too much into things, that his children were just busy with their own lives. But I could feel it in my bones, this systematic campaign to make me invisible, to reduce me from stepmother back to father's wife, and eventually not even that. Still, I kept showing up, kept bringing gifts to birthdays where my presence felt tolerated rather than welcomed, kept extending invitations that were declined with transparent excuses, kept loving these people who were slowly but deliberately cutting me out of the family story, because what else do you do when you've invested 25 years in people? When giving up means admitting that maybe you never belonged there in the first place. Maybe all that love and sacrifice and devotion was just elaborate charity work that nobody ever really wanted. When the cancer diagnosis came, everything changed overnight. And suddenly, I wasn't just Richard's wife anymore. I was his nurse, his advocate, his lifeline. While his precious children, who couldn't be bothered to return my calls for months, were suddenly very interested in having long private conversations with their father about estate planning and financial matters. I spent 18 months sleeping in a chair next to his hospital bed, learning to administer medications and manage feeding tubes, driving him to chemotherapy appointments 3 times a week, while Jessica called maybe once every 2 weeks, and Michael showed up for exactly 4 visits during the entire ordeal, each time with a legal pad full of questions about investments and insurance policies and the house deed. I watched Richard wither away from a strong, vibrant man to someone who could barely lift his head, and I was there for every single moment of it, changing his bed sheets when he was too weak to move, feeding him ice chips when his throat was raw from radiation, holding his hand through those long, dark nights when the pain was so bad he couldn't sleep. And where were his devoted children then? They were busy with their careers, their families, their lives that somehow never had room for watching their father die slowly, but they always had time to discuss his will, always had energy for conversations about who would inherit what and when. Richard would squeeze my hand during those awful treatments and promise me that everything was taken care of, that I'd never have to worry about money or housing because I'd earned my security through love and sacrifice, that the will was ironclad, and his children understood that I deserved to be protected and provided for after everything I'd done for this family. "You're going to be fine," he'd whisper during those morphine-hazed nights when death felt close enough to touch. "I've made sure of it. You'll always have a home. You'll always be taken care of, because you've been my angel through all of this." I believed him because I had to, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider, that after giving up my career, my independence, my entire adult life to this family, I might end up with nothing but memories and medical bills. But Richard kept promising, kept reassuring, kept telling me that his children finally understood what I meant to him, what I'd sacrificed, how much I deserved to be honored and protected even after he was gone. When Richard finally died on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, I thought grief would be the hardest thing I'd have to face. But I was wrong, because grief got shoved aside by the cold, brutal efficiency with which his children took over everything, starting with the funeral arrangements that I'd assumed we'd planned together as a family. I called Jessica within an hour of his passing, my voice breaking as I tried to tell her that her father was gone, and instead of tears or comfort, I got this businesslike response about how she and Michael would handle everything, how I shouldn't worry about the details, how they knew what their father would have wanted, as if I hadn't been married to him for 25 years, as if I hadn't been holding his hand when he took his last breath. They chose the funeral home without consulting me, picked the casket based on conversations I wasn't part of, wrote an obituary that mentioned me as an afterthought. And when I tried to contribute ideas about the service, Jessica patted my arm like I was a confused elderly relative and said they had it all under control. At the funeral itself, I felt like a stranger attending the service of someone I'd never met, sitting in the front row but somehow feeling miles away from the family story being told, listening to eulogies that painted Richard as a devoted father while barely acknowledging the woman who'd spent the last quarter-century of his life loving him through everything. People kept approaching me with condolences, but I noticed how Jessica and Michael positioned themselves as the primary grievers, accepting flowers and making decisions about the reception as if I was just another mourner instead of the widow. And when Richard's lawyer approached me quietly to schedule a meeting about the will, I saw Jessica and Michael exchange this look, this quick, satisfied glance that made something cold settle in my stomach. After everyone left and the house felt impossibly empty, I found Jessica going through Richard's desk drawers, Michael boxing up his clothes with methodical precision, and when I asked what they were doing, Jessica said they were just helping, just taking care of things, but there was something in their voices, something that felt less like grief and more like anticipation, like they were already dividing up the spoils of a life I'd shared. The call from Richard's lawyer came 3 days after the funeral, and at first I thought it was just procedural, just scheduling the formal reading of the will that Richard had always told me would leave me secure and comfortable. But there was something in Mr. Henderson's voice, a hesitation that made my blood run cold even before he said the words that shattered my world. Mrs. Matthews, I need to inform you that your husband made some changes to his will during his illness, significant changes that I'm legally obligated to discuss with you before the formal reading. And I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, because Richard had never mentioned changes, had never said anything about altering the arrangements we'd discussed for years. The will had been rewritten just 3 months before his death, during that terrible period when the cancer had spread to his brain and the medications made him confused and paranoid. When Jessica and Michael had suddenly started those frequent visits I'd been so grateful for, thinking they'd finally realized they were losing their father and wanted to make peace. But they hadn't come to make peace. They'd come to whisper poison in his ear during his weakest moments, convincing him that I was only with him for his money, that I'd abandon his children the moment he was gone, that blood was thicker than whatever vows I'd made at an altar 25 years ago. When I confronted them the next day, showing up at Jessica's house with the lawyer's words still ringing in my ears, I expected denials, I expected shock, I expected something resembling human decency, but instead I got Jessica's cool smile and Michael's satisfied shrug, like they'd been waiting for this conversation for months. Dad finally came to his senses, Jessica said, not even bothering to look ashamed. He realized that his real family should inherit what he worked his whole life to build. Not some woman who swooped in after Mom died and played house for a few decades. Michael nodded along, adding with this casual cruelty that still takes my breath away. You got 25 years of living in our house, wearing our mother's jewelry, playing dress-up as our stepmother, that should be payment enough for your services. And I realized that every kindness they'd ever shown me, every moment I'd thought we were building something real, had been nothing but an elaborate performance while they waited for their father to die so they could finally show me who they really were. But then Richard's sister Margaret called, and for the first time since the funeral I heard a voice that didn't make me feel like I was losing my mind, a voice that said what I'd been afraid to even think myself. Margaret had been watching everything from the sidelines for 25 years, seeing how her brother's children treated me, how they'd never accepted the love I'd poured into their family, and she was furious about the will change in a way that made me realize I wasn't imagining things, wasn't being dramatic or entitled or whatever, Jessica and Michael had convinced their father I was during those final months. Something stinks about this whole thing, Margaret said when she showed up at my door with a bottle of wine and a legal pad full of questions. Richard talked to me about that dozens of times over the years. He was adamant that you'd be taken care of. He knew how much you'd sacrificed for those ungrateful kids. And now suddenly he changes everything when he's barely coherent from cancer treatments. She'd been asking around, talking to other family members, to Richard's friends, to anyone who'd spoken with him during those final months. And what she found painted a picture of a dying man being systematically manipulated by children who'd finally seen their opportunity to get rid of the stepmother they'd resented for decades. Margaret remembered the Christmas when Richard had pulled her aside to show her the will provisions, how proud he'd been of the way he'd structured things to ensure I'd never have to worry about money or housing. How he'd said Jessica and Michael were finally mature enough to understand that I deserved security after everything I'd given to the family. That was less than 2 years ago, Margaret said, her eyes blazing with the kind of righteous anger I'd forgotten I was allowed to feel. And now I'm supposed to believe he just changed his mind because those 2 vultures whispered in his ear while he was dying. She wasn't just offering comfort. She was offering something I'd lost completely in the days since Richard's death. She was offering validation that I wasn't crazy, that the life I'd lived and the love I'd given had been real and valuable, that what was happening to me was wrong in every possible way. And for the first time since that horrible phone call from the lawyer, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this fight. Margaret and I started digging into the timeline like detectives, and what we found made my stomach turn because the pattern was so deliberate, so calculated, that it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence or natural family reconciliation. The will had been changed on February 15th, just 6 weeks before Richard died, on the exact same day that his oncologist had noted in his medical records that the brain metastases were affecting his cognitive function and decision-making abilities, that he was experiencing confusion and paranoia as side effects of the high-dose steroids they were using to reduce swelling. Jessica had driven him to that lawyer's appointment alone, telling me she wanted to give me a break from caregiving duties, and I'd been so grateful for her sudden helpfulness that I hadn't questioned why she needed to be there, for what she claimed was just updating some insurance beneficiaries. But Margaret tracked down the lawyer's secretary, who remembered the appointment clearly because Jessica had done most of the talking, while Richard sat there looking confused and exhausted. And when the lawyer had tried to explain the implications of removing me from the will entirely, Richard had seemed surprised, asking if that was really what he'd requested. Margaret also discovered that Michael had visited his father 3 times that week alone. Unprecedented attention from a son who'd barely called during the previous year of illness, and Richard's hospice nurse remembered those visits, because afterward, Richard would be agitated and suspicious, asking her strange questions about whether I was really taking care of him or just waiting for him to die so I could inherit his money. The timing was surgical in its precision, targeting the exact window when Richard was most vulnerable, most confused, most susceptible to suggestions that his wife of 25 years was some kind of gold-digging predator who'd been playing the long game for decades. Margaret found Richard's old appointment books where he'd written reminders to himself about protecting me in the will, found emails he'd sent to his financial advisor just 8 months before his death, confirming that his estate planning was designed to ensure I'd never have to worry about anything, found a birthday card he'd given me 2 years ago, where he'd written in his own handwriting that I was the best decision he'd ever made, and he'd make sure I was always taken care of. The evidence was building into something undeniable, painting a picture of 2 adults who'd waited patiently for their father's mind to weaken just enough that they could finally erase the stepmother they'd never wanted from the family story permanently. With the will reading still weeks away, Jessica and Michael started acting like they'd already inherited everything, and their arrogance was so brazen, so dismissive of my grief and my 25 years in that family, that it took my breath away how quickly they'd transformed from reluctant stepchildren into entitled heirs who couldn't wait to erase me from their father's legacy. Jessica started showing up at the house with a realtor, walking through rooms where I was still sleeping, still grieving, discussing renovation plans and market values like I was already gone, like I was just a temporary inconvenience they'd soon be rid of. And when I asked what she was doing, she smiled that cold, satisfied smile and said she was just exploring options for Dad's property, as if it had never been my home too. Michael began making announcements to extended family about how he and Jessica were going to honor their father's memory by preserving his estate for his real children, his blood relatives, the people who truly understood what Richard would have wanted. And there was this narrative they'd constructed where I was some kind of interloper who'd been taking advantage of their grieving father for decades, where they were the heroes swooping in to protect his legacy from the woman who'd somehow tricked him into marriage. They started calling me by my first name, instead of the stepmother titles they'd grudgingly used for years, started referring to Richard as their father exclusively, never our father or your husband, just their father, like they were reclaiming him from me posthumously. And when people at the grocery store or church would offer me condolences about losing my husband, I'd catch Jessica or Michael nearby, ready to interject with corrections about how I was just the second wife, how the real family was handling everything now. The most infuriating part was how they'd positioned themselves as the responsible ones, the mature adults who were taking care of business while the grieving widow fell apart. But I wasn't falling apart. I was being systematically erased by two people who'd never appreciated what their father and I had built together, who'd spent 25 years waiting for this exact moment when they could finally, legally, permanently remove me from the family story they'd never wanted me to be part of anyway. That's when something shifted inside me, something I hadn't felt since I was young and ambitious, and believed I could conquer the world, and Margaret saw it too. This transformation, from grieving widow to strategic fighter, and she nodded approvingly when I told her we weren't just going to roll over and let Jessica and Michael steal 25 years of my life without a fight. We started meeting at coffee shops and her kitchen table, building a case like prosecutors preparing for trial. And I felt my mind sharpening in ways it hadn't since I'd given up my marketing career to become a full-time stepmother and wife. Felt the analytical skills I'd buried under decades of domestic life resurging as we organized evidence into timelines and witness statements and documentation that painted a clear picture of manipulation and elder abuse. Margaret brought her legal background from her years as a paralegal, and I brought the meticulous record-keeping habits that had served me well in maintaining household files and medical records, and together we created a database of every conversation, every visit, every suspicious moment from Richard's final months that demonstrated a pattern of calculated influence over a dying man's compromised judgment. I started carrying a small notebook, writing down every interaction with Jessica and Michael, every arrogant comment and dismissive gesture, every piece of evidence that showed their true character and intentions, and instead of feeling helpless and betrayed, I felt focused and determined in a way that reminded me who I used to be before I decided that love meant sacrificing my own strength for other people's comfort. We researched the legal requirements for valid will changes, the obligations lawyers have to ensure mental competency, the definitions of undue influence and elder abuse. And what we found gave me hope for the first time since Richard's death, because there were protections in place for exactly this kind of situation. Laws designed to prevent greedy relatives from manipulating vulnerable elderly people into changing their estate plans. Margaret helped me understand that patience would be our greatest weapon, that we needed to let Jessica and Michael continue revealing their true selves while we quietly built our case, that rushing into accusations would only put them on guard and give them time to cover their tracks. So I learned to smile and nod when they made their cruel comments, to document their overconfidence and cruelty while appearing defeated and helpless, because the best revenge is the kind your enemies never see coming. We became forensic archaeologists of my own life, digging through 25 years of marriage to find every piece of evidence that proved Richard's true intentions and the children's systematic campaign to undermine them, and I was amazed at how much proof I'd accumulated without even realizing it, how my habit of saving cards and letters and photos had created an archive of love and promises that Jessica and Michael never knew existed. I found dozens of birthday and anniversary cards where Richard had written in his own handwriting about making sure I'd always be secure, about how I deserved everything good in life because of what I'd given to his family, about how the will was structured to protect me no matter what happened, and Margaret photographed every single one with her phone, creating a digital record that would be impossible to dispute. We tracked down Richard's longtime financial advisor, who remembered multiple conversations about estate planning, where Richard had specifically emphasized that I needed to be the primary beneficiary because I'd sacrificed my career and independence for his family, and the advisor was horrified to learn about the will change, saying it went against everything Richard had told him for years about his intentions and values. Margaret reached out to the hospice nurses who'd cared for Richard during those final weeks, and they remembered Jessica and Michael's visits vividly because afterward Richard would become agitated and suspicious, asking strange questions about my motives that were completely out of character for a man who'd trusted me implicitly for decades. We found neighbors who'd witnessed Jessica measuring rooms and discussing renovation plans while I was at Richard's bedside in the hospital. Friends who'd overheard Michael making phone calls about real estate values and inheritance tax implications before his father had even died. Family members who'd been shocked by the children's sudden interest in their father's finances after years of barely maintaining contact. I collected photos spanning 25 years that told the real story of our family. Images of me at every important moment, every celebration, every milestone, proof that I hadn't been some peripheral figure, but the heart of Richard's domestic life. The woman who'd built traditions and created memories and held everything together while his children lived their separate lives and waited for their inheritance. And with each piece of evidence we gathered, I felt less like a victim and more like a prosecutor, building an unbreakable case for justice. So there I was, back in that sterile law office with the buzzing fluorescent lights, sitting across from Jessica and Michael, who could barely contain their excitement as Mr. Henderson shuffled through his papers with the kind of professional solemnity that felt like a funeral march for my entire adult life. They dressed for the occasion like they were attending a celebration rather than the legal dismantling of their stepmother's security. Jessica in a bright red blazer that screamed victory, and Michael in his best suit, the one he'd worn to his father's funeral. And there was this electric anticipation between them, this barely suppressed joy that made my stomach turn as I sat there in my simple black dress, playing the role of the defeated widow while my notebook full of evidence burned like a secret weapon in my purse. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began the formal reading with all the legal language that makes normal human emotions sound clinical and cold. And I watched Jessica's face light up as he read through the provisions that stripped me of everything Richard and I had built together over 25 years of marriage. To my beloved children, Jessica and Michael, I leave the family home located at 42 Maple Street, all investment accounts, retirement funds, and the remainder of my estate. And the words hit the air like hammer blows while Jessica actually started smiling, not even bothering to hide her satisfaction anymore, and Michael leaned back in his chair like he'd just won the lottery, which I suppose from his perspective he had. The will continued with its devastating efficiency, removing me from bank accounts I'd helped fund, from retirement plans I'd contributed to, from the house where I'd spent half my life creating a home for people who'd never wanted me there in the first place, and with each legal phrase I felt myself shrinking in that chair, appearing more broken and defeated while inside. I was counting down the moments until Margaret's research and my evidence and all those documented lies would finally matter. Jessica couldn't resist twisting the knife, looking directly at me as the lawyer finished reading and saying with mock sympathy, "I know this must be hard for you, but Dad finally realized where his loyalties should lie, with his real family." And Michael nodded along, adding that cruel line that still echoes in my mind. "You get nothing, Mom," the word dripping with 25 years of accumulated resentment and satisfaction. The moment Mr. Henderson finished reading, Jessica and Michael erupted into this disgusting display of triumph that made me understand exactly what kind of people I'd been sharing a family with for 25 years. And Jessica actually clapped her hands together like she'd just watched her favorite team win the championship, turning to Michael with this gleeful expression and saying, "Well, that's settled then. We can finally move forward without any complications." As if I was just a complication, just an obstacle that had finally been legally removed from their path to prosperity. Michael was even worse, stretching in his chair like he'd just finished a satisfying meal and looking at me with this patronizing smile that made my blood boil, saying, "I hope you've been saving your pennies, because you're going to need to find somewhere else to live pretty quickly. We've already got plans for the house, and they don't include a tenant." And the casual cruelty of it, the way he could discuss making me homeless while sitting 3 feet away from me, showed me exactly who these people really were underneath all those years of forced politeness. Jessica started talking about timeline expectations, how she assumed I'd need maybe 30 days to pack up my belongings and find an apartment somewhere. Maybe something small and affordable, since I'd never really worked during the marriage, had I? And she was sure there were nice senior communities that would take someone in my situation. Wasn't that thoughtful of her to consider my limited options? They discussed my future like I wasn't even in the room, speculating about whether I'd kept any of my old marketing contacts who might help me find some kind of entry-level job, whether I'd saved any money of my own over the years, or if I'd spent it all on playing house with their father, and through it all, Mr. Henderson sat perfectly still behind his desk, watching everything with these sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to be cataloguing every word, every gesture, every moment of their performance. And I noticed how his fingers drummed silently on a manila folder that sat separate from the will documents, how he kept glancing at me with something that looked almost like anticipation, like he was waiting for something, like this whole horrible scene was just the opening act of a much longer show. But then Mr. Henderson did something that changed everything. Something that made Jessica's triumphant smile freeze on her face and caused Michael to sit up straighter in his chair, because he reached into his briefcase with deliberate precision and pulled out a second envelope, a sealed manila envelope that was clearly older and more worn than the documents he'd just finished reading, and he placed it on the desk between us, like a bomb waiting to explode. "However," he said in that careful lawyer voice that suddenly sounded different, more authoritative, more knowing, "there appears to be an additional document that requires our attention. A will that was executed prior to the one I just read, and according to the legal documentation I have here. This earlier will may take precedence under specific circumstances that I believe apply to this situation." Jessica's face went from triumph to confusion to something approaching panic in the space of about 5 seconds, and she leaned forward in her chair, her voice rising with the first hint of desperation I'd heard from her all day, saying, "What do you mean additional document? What are you talking about? Dad only had one will. We were there when he changed it." Michael was already calculating, already trying to figure out how this could affect their victory, asking questions about dates and legal validity while his confidence cracked around the edges, and I sat there feeling my heart pound because Margaret and I had suspected something like this might exist, had hoped that Richard's lifelong habit of careful documentation might have protected us in ways we hadn't even imagined. Mr. Henderson opened the envelope with ceremonial slowness, explaining that this will had been executed 18 months earlier, during a period when Richard's medical records clearly showed mental competency and decision-making capacity, properly witnessed by 2 independent parties who had no financial interest in the estate, and filed with his office according to all legal requirements for valid estate planning. "This document," he continued while Jessica and Michael exchanged increasingly frantic looks, "specifically includes provisions that protect Mrs. Matthews in the event that any subsequent will changes were made during periods of medical compromise or undue influence, and based on the timeline of your father's illness and the circumstances surrounding the February revision, I believe those provisions are now legally applicable." The room went completely silent except for the buzzing of those fluorescent lights, and I watched 25 years of Jessica and Michael's patient planning crumble as they realized their father had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. As Mr. Henderson read the true will, the one Richard had crafted when his mind was clear and his heart was full of love for the woman who devoted her life to his family, I watched Jessica and Michael's faces transform from confusion to horror to desperate panic, because this document didn't just protect me. It laid out conditions that would govern their inheritance for the rest of their lives. "To my beloved wife, Mr. Henderson read in his steady voice, I leave the family home, 75% of all assets, and complete control over the estate, because she has earned every penny through 25 years of unconditional love and sacrifice that my children have never fully appreciated." And Jessica actually gasped, her hand flying to her throat like she was choking on her own shock, while Michael started shaking his head like he could make the words disappear through sheer force of denial. But Richard had been thorough, oh so thorough, because the will continued to outline that Jessica and Michael would receive their inheritance only if they maintained respectful relationships with me, only if they included me in family gatherings and decisions, only if they honored the woman their father had chosen to love and protect, and any violation of these conditions would result in their portions being donated to charity, specifically to organizations that support elder abuse prevention and step-family counseling. Furthermore, the lawyer continued while both children sat there looking like they'd been slapped, Any attempts to manipulate, coerce, or influence subsequent changes to this will, during periods of illness or mental compromise, will result in immediate forfeiture of all inheritance rights. And I have specifically instructed my attorney to investigate any such attempts and pursue legal remedies, including criminal charges for elder abuse. Jessica was on her feet now, her voice shrill and desperate, as she demanded to know how this was possible, how her father could have been so cruel, how he could have chosen his second wife over his own blood. But Michael was quieter, deadlier, already trying to calculate legal challenges and loopholes, asking about the validity of conditions and the timeline of execution. But Mr. Henderson had anticipated everything, had documentation and witnesses and medical records that proved beyond any doubt that this will represented Richard's true intentions, his final protection of the woman who'd loved him when his own children saw only dollar signs. But the most devastating moment came when Mr. Henderson reached into that same envelope and pulled out a handwritten letter, sealed in Richard's own envelope with my name written across the front in his familiar handwriting. And as the lawyer handed it to me with gentle solemnity, I could see Jessica and Michael leaning forward despite themselves, desperate to know what final words their father had left for the woman they'd tried so hard to erase from his story. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, but my voice was steady as I read aloud the letter that would haunt his children for the rest of their lives. Richard's final testament to the love we'd shared and the disappointment he felt in the people he'd raised. "My dearest wife," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my children have shown exactly who they really are, and I am both heartbroken and vindicated by their predictable greed and cruelty toward the woman who has been the greatest blessing of my life." Somehow he'd known that they would try to manipulate him during his illness, would see his vulnerability as an opportunity to finally get rid of the stepmother they'd resented for 25 years, and he'd prepared for it with the strategic mind that had made him successful in business and the loving heart that had made him a devoted husband. "I gave them every opportunity to prove me wrong," the letter continued, "every chance to show respect and gratitude for the woman who raised them when they needed raising, who loved them when they refused to love back, who sacrificed her own dreams to build a family around my children, who never appreciated what they had." Richard had orchestrated this entire scenario, allowing the will change during his illness while secretly maintaining the original protections. Watching from his deathbed, as Jessica and Michael revealed their true nature, their eagerness to strip me of security and dignity the moment he was no longer there to protect me. "You have been my angel, my partner, my greatest love," the letter concluded, "and I will not allow my children's selfishness to destroy the woman who made my life complete. I am sorry they never learned to love you the way you deserved, but I will make sure they can never hurt you again." The beautiful irony of their situation became crystal clear as Mr. Henderson outlined the exact terms of their reduced inheritance, because Richard had given Jessica and Michael exactly what they'd always given me, conditional love with impossible standards, and now they were the ones begging for acceptance from someone who held all the power. They would each receive $50,000, a fraction of what they'd expected, and only if they could prove for an entire year that they were capable of treating me with the respect and inclusion they'd denied me for 25 years, which meant family dinners where I was welcomed, holiday celebrations where I belonged, genuine apologies for their years of cruelty, and public acknowledgement of my role as their father's beloved wife, and their stepmother who'd earned her place in the family through decades of unconditional love. Jessica immediately started crying, not tears of grief, but tears of desperation and calculation, suddenly calling me Mom again for the first time in years, reaching across the table to grab my hands and babbling about how sorry she was, how she'd been grieving and not thinking clearly, how she'd always loved me really, deep down, and couldn't we just forget about this whole misunderstanding and be a family again? Michael was more strategic in his panic, talking about legal challenges and appealing the conditions, but when Miss Henderson calmly explained that contesting the will would result in immediate forfeiture of everything and potential criminal charges for the elder abuse they'd already committed, his bravado crumbled into the same desperate pleading as his sister. They offered me deals, compromises, percentage splits of the inheritance if I'd just tell the lawyer that the conditions were too harsh, that I forgave them completely and wanted them to have their full inheritance. But I sat there listening to their panic with the same calm smile Jessica had worn an hour earlier when she thought she was inheriting everything, and I realized that this was what justice felt like. Not revenge exactly, but the simple pleasure of watching people reap exactly what they'd sown for 25 years. Walking out of that law office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, this incredible lightness that comes from finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept anything less than what you deserve. And as Jessica and Michael followed me into the parking lot with their desperate pleas and sudden declarations of love, I realized that for the first time in 25 years, I held all the cards, and they were the ones begging for scraps of affection from someone who'd moved beyond caring what they thought of me. They wanted to take me to lunch, to sit down and have a real conversation about rebuilding our relationship, to show me how much they'd changed in the 2 hours since they'd learned about their reduced inheritance. But I looked at these two middle-aged adults, who'd spent my entire marriage waiting for their chance to destroy me, and I felt nothing but pity for people so consumed by greed that they'd wasted decades refusing love from someone who'd only ever wanted to be their family. "You know what's funny?" I said as they stood there in the parking lot looking lost and desperate. "Your father gave you the same gift he gave me 25 years ago, the chance to be part of a real family, to love and be loved unconditionally, but you threw it away because you thought blood was more important than character, because you thought inheritance was more valuable than relationship." Jessica started crying again, promising that things would be different now, that she understood what she'd lost, that she wanted me to be her mother in every way that mattered. But I'd heard these promises before during holidays and birthdays when she needed something from me, and I wasn't interested in being anyone's conditional family member anymore. I told them they were welcome to try meeting Richard's conditions, welcome to spend the next year proving they were capable of genuine respect and inclusion. But I wouldn't be holding my breath or rearranging my life to accommodate people who'd made it clear for 25 years that they only valued me when it served their purposes. For the first time since I was 28 years old, I was truly free to build a life based on my own worth, rather than other people's approval, free to surround myself with people who chose to love me, rather than people who barely tolerated my existence. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my beautiful home that Richard made sure I'd never lose, surrounded by friends who choose to be in my life rather than people who tolerate my existence. And I understand now that the greatest gift my husband gave me wasn't the house or the money, or even the poetic justice of watching his children scramble to prove they deserve their inheritance. It was the final lesson that my worth was never dependent on other people's approval, that love should lift you up rather than make you smaller, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept cruelty disguised as family obligation. Jessica and Michael have been trying to meet Richard's conditions, sending awkward text messages and showing up with flowers and invitations to dinners where they practice treating me like family. But there's something performative about it, something calculated that reminds me why genuine relationships can't be bought or legislated or forced through legal documents. They have to grow from mutual respect and authentic care, qualities that can't be faked for an entire year, no matter how much money depends on it. I've learned to trust my instincts about people, to recognize the difference between someone who loves you and someone who needs you, between family that includes you and family that merely accommodates you. And while I haven't completely closed the door on Jessica and Michael, I'm no longer willing to shrink myself to fit into spaces where I'm not genuinely wanted. Here's what I want you to understand if you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, if you're the one always giving more than you receive. Always making excuses for people who treat you as optional, always hoping that if you just love hard enough and long enough, everyone will eventually see your worth. You don't have to wait for a deathbed revelation or a legal document to start valuing yourself. You don't have to accept breadcrumbs of affection from people who should be giving you the whole meal. And you absolutely don't have to keep people in your life just because you've invested years in loving them if they've never invested anything in loving you back.